Hunter versus detective. Who will survive the final showdown? Chapter 1. The Marked Man. Detective Hannah Carter was on the verge of exhaustion. The manhunt had drained her both physically and mentally, but she knew she couldn't afford to falter now. The city was in the grip of fear, terrorized by a killer the press had dubbed the Hunter. He was a meticulous predator, leaving behind no evidence except the brutalized bodies of his victims. For months, Hannah had chased shadows, but tonight, something felt different. The latest victim had been found in his office, a wealthy businessman who had been shot execution-style in the back of the head. The scene was gruesomely familiar, but this time, there was something new. A partial fingerprint on the whiskey glass beside the body. It was the first tangible lead they had uncovered in months. Hannah's partner, Detective Michael Tate, hovered behind her, his expression tense as he watched her examine the crime scene photos laid out on her desk. "Do you think it's him?" he asked, his voice edged with the same weariness she felt. "It has to be," Hannah replied, not taking her eyes off the fingerprint analysis. "It's too similar to the others. The same MO, the same lack of evidence. Except for this." She tapped the fingerprint image on the screen. "He made a mistake." Tate nodded, but there was no relief in his eyes. They both knew how elusive the Hunter had been. Each time they thought they were close, he would slip through their fingers, leaving nothing but another corpse in his wake. Hannah leaned back in her chair, running a hand through her hair. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but there would be no rest tonight. They needed to act quickly before the trail went cold. She picked up the phone and dialed the lab, ordering a rush on the fingerprint analysis. Every minute counted. As they waited, Hannah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was a subtle sensation, one she had started noticing weeks ago. A prickling on the back of her neck, a sense of unease that wouldn't go away. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the stress of the case, but it lingered. "Do you ever feel like he's watching us?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. Tate frowned. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she admitted, feeling foolish for even bringing it up. "It's just, sometimes I get the sense that he's one step ahead of us, like he knows what we're going to do before we do it." Tate gave her a sidelong glance. "This case is getting to you, Hannah. We're all on edge, but we'll catch him. We have to." Hannah nodded, but her unease only grew as the night wore on. They received the fingerprint results early the next morning. Marcus Drayton, a man with a criminal record for petty theft and assault, but nothing that suggested he was capable of the cold-blooded murders they were dealing with. Yet his fingerprint was there on the glass, linking him to the crime. They had a name, but now they needed the man. Hannah wasted no time organizing a raid on Drayton's last known address, a dingy apartment in a rundown part of town. The team moved in swiftly, breaching the door and sweeping through the small space, but it was clear Drayton wasn't there. The apartment was empty, save for the stench of decay and the remnants of a hasty departure. Hannah's frustration mounted as they searched the apartment. There were no clues, no signs of where Drayton might have gone. The only thing they found was a message scrawled on the bathroom mirror in red lipstick. "You're getting warmer." The words sent a chill down her spine. This was no ordinary killer. He was taunting them, playing with them like a cat with a mouse. But why? What was his endgame? Hannah stared at the message, her mind racing. The fingerprint, the message, it was all too deliberate. The Hunter was leading them somewhere, but where? "Pack it up," she ordered, her voice tight with frustration. "We need to track down his connections. Anyone who might know where he's hiding." But as they left the apartment, Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The prickling sensation on the back of her neck was stronger now, almost unbearable. She scanned the surrounding buildings, but saw nothing, just shadows. Unbeknownst to Hannah, the Hunter was indeed watching, hidden in plain sight. He had been following her every move, studying her just as he had his victims. She was smart, resourceful, and relentless, exactly the kind of prey he enjoyed. But she was also becoming too much of a threat. It was time to change the game. The hunter had chosen his next target. Her. Chapter 2. The Stalker. Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The apartment raid had turned up nothing useful except the unsettling message, and now she was left with a nagging sense of dread. The case was getting under her skin in a way no other had before, and the sensation of being watched was growing more intense by the day. She drove home that night, her mind replaying the events of the day over and over. The city lights blurred as she sped through the empty streets, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and frustration. She had been a detective for nearly a decade, had faced down murderers and maniacs, but the hunter was different. He was methodical, calculating, always staying one step ahead. Hannah parked in front of her apartment building, taking a moment to gather herself before stepping out of the car. The streets were quiet, eerily so, and she felt the now familiar prickling on the back of her neck as she scanned the shadows. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it as paranoia, but the feeling wouldn't go away. She hurried inside, locking the door behind her with more care than usual. The apartment was dark, silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Hannah set her keys on the counter and made her way to the bedroom, where she collapsed onto the bed, too tired to even change out of her clothes. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the crime scenes, the victims' faces staring back at her with lifeless eyes, and that message on the mirror, *, you're getting warmer. *, what did it mean? Was he leading her somewhere? Or was it just another mind game? Hannah tossed and turned, the unease gnawing at her. She reached for her phone, scrolling through the messages and missed calls, trying to distract herself. But then, a text popped up from an unknown number. "I'm closer than you think." Her heart skipped a beat as she read the words. She sat up, her eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of an intruder. But the apartment was empty, just as she had left it. She quickly checked the locks on the doors and windows, but everything was secure. Another text came through. "You're next." Hannah's breath caught in her throat. She called her team immediately, her voice shaking as she relayed the messages. Within minutes, officers were at her door, sweeping the apartment for any signs of entry. But there was nothing. No one had been there. Hannah's fear began to morph into anger. The hunter was playing with her, taunting her, trying to unnerve her. But she wouldn't let him win. She couldn't afford to. The next morning, Hannah arrived at the precinct with renewed determination. She was done playing his game. It was time to take the fight to him. She gathered her team and laid out a plan to track down Marcus Drayton, the only lead they had. They started with Drayton's known associates, old friends, ex-girlfriends, anyone who might know where he was hiding. It was slow, painstaking work, but they managed to track down a few people who had seen Drayton recently. Most of them claimed to know nothing about his current whereabouts, but one woman, an ex-girlfriend named Lisa, mentioned something that caught Hannah's attention. "He was obsessed with this cabin in the woods," Lisa said, her voice tinged with fear. "He used to talk about it all the time, said it was his escape, his sanctuary." Hannah pressed for more details, and Lisa reluctantly gave her the location. It was a remote area, far from the city, the kind of place where someone could disappear without a trace. Hannah wasted no time. She organized a team to check out the cabin, hoping this would be the break they needed. The drive out there was long, the road winding through dense forests that seemed to close in around them. The sense of isolation was almost suffocating, and Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. When they finally arrived, the cabin was exactly as Lisa had described. Small, weathered, and secluded. The perfect place for someone to hide. But as they approached, something felt off. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost unnatural. They moved in cautiously, weapons drawn, ready for anything. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The cabin was sparsely furnished. with a single chair and a table in the center of the room. But what caught Hannah's attention was the wall behind the table. It was covered in photographs, dozens of them, each one showing a different angle of her face. Some were taken from a distance, others up close, all of them eerily intimate. There were shots of her at work, at home, even from her childhood. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The hunter had been watching her for a long time. Hannah's stomach churned as she took in the wall of images. This wasn't just a case anymore, it was personal. He had been following her, studying her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now she was right where he wanted her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she nearly jumped out of her skin. Another text from the unknown number. "Welcome home." Hannah's blood ran cold as she read the message. The hunter had lured her here to this place, and she had walked right into his trap. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. A small, nondescript door at the back of the cabin. She approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear faint sounds coming from the other side, a low, rhythmic thumping. She motioned for her team to follow as she pushed the door open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The thumping grew louder as they descended, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, dimly lit basement. The walls were lined with hunting trophies, animal heads mounted on plaques, their glassy eyes staring lifelessly at the intruders. But it was the far end of the room that caught Hannah's attention. A figure sat in the shadows, bound to a chair, head slumped forward. As they approached, the figure stirred, revealing a bruised and bloodied face. Marcus Drayton. He looked up at them with terror in his eyes, his voice weak and trembling. "It's him," Drayton rasped. "He's coming for you." Before Hannah could ask anything more, the lights in the basement flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Chapter 3. The Escape. Hannah's heart raced as the lights blinked out, plunging the basement into a suffocating darkness. Her team's flashlights flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The room was silent except for the ragged breathing of Marcus Drayton, still bound to the chair, and the steady thumping that reverberated through the floorboards. "Stay alert," Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible. She swept her flashlight around the room, searching for any sign of movement. The hunter was out there, somewhere in the shadows, watching them. She could feel his presence, like a cold breath on the back of her neck. "Get Drayton out of here," she ordered, motioning to two officers. "The rest of you, fan out and secure the area." The officers moved quickly, untying Drayton and half-carrying, half-dragging him up the narrow stairs. Hannah stayed behind with the remaining officers, her mind racing. This basement, with its macabre decorations and cold, musty air, felt like the heart of the hunter's twisted world. It was a place of death, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were trespassing on sacred ground. A creak from the far side of the room caught her attention. Hannah swung her flashlight in that direction, catching a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The others were still moving cautiously through the room, their lights sweeping over the dusty floor. But Hannah was fixed on that shadow, convinced she had seen something. There was another creak, and then a soft click, like the sound of a gun being cocked. Hannah's instincts screamed at her to move, but before she could react, a shot rang out. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, and one of the officers crumpled to the ground, clutching his side. "Down!" Hannah shouted, diving behind a stack of old crates. The other officers followed suit, taking cover wherever they could. The basement was now alive with movement, their flashlights darting in every direction, trying to pinpoint the shooter's location. But the hunter was too clever. He knew this place too well. He was using the darkness, the maze of shadows, to his advantage. Another shot rang out, and Hannah heard the dull thud of a bullet striking wood inches from her head. "We need to get out of here." Tate's voice cut through the chaos, his tone urgent. "We're sitting ducks." Hannah knew he was right. They were out of their element, trapped in a place where the hunter held all the cards. But retreating meant giving up the advantage they had fought so hard to gain. If they left now, the hunter would vanish into the night, and the trail would go cold once more. But they couldn't stay. Not like this. "Fall back," she ordered, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "Regroup at the entrance." The team began to retreat, moving cautiously back toward the staircase. Hannah covered their exit, her gun trained on the dark corners of the room, ready for any sign of movement. She felt exposed, vulnerable in the narrow confines of the basement, every instinct screaming at her to run. Just as she reached the stairs, a movement caught her eye. The hunter was there, just a few feet away, his face obscured by the shadows. For a split second, their eyes met, and Hannah felt a jolt of recognition. It was him, the man who had been haunting her nightmares, the predator who had turned her life into a living hell. But before she could react, he disappeared into the darkness, as if he had never been there at all. Hannah's pulse pounded in her ears as she climbed the stairs, her mind reeling from the encounter. They had been so close, close enough for her to feel his presence, to see the cold, calculating look in his eyes. But he had slipped away, just as he always did. They regrouped outside the cabin, the cold night air a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the basement. Drayton was lying on the ground, his face pale, his body trembling uncontrollably. The officers who had carried him out were trying to revive him, but his breathing was shallow, his eyes unfocused. "He's in shock," one of the medics said, checking Drayton's pulse. "We need to get him to a hospital." Hannah nodded, barely hearing the words. Her thoughts were consumed by the brief glimpse she had caught of the hunter. There had been something in his eyes, something that chilled her to the bone. He wasn't just a killer. He was a monster, someone who thrived on the fear and pain of others. But now, for the first time, she had seen him, had looked into the eyes of the man she had been hunting for months. And she knew, with a certainty that made her stomach churn, that he had seen her too. As they loaded Drayton into an ambulance, Hannah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart sinking as she saw the message from the unknown number. "Asterisk, you're closer than ever, detective. But the hunt has only just begun." Asterisk. Hannah stared at the words, a sense of dread washing over her. The hunter was right. This was far from over. He had led them here, to this cabin, to this basement, but it was all part of his twisted game. And now he was challenging her to keep playing. But this time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to. Chapter 4. The Confession. The drive back to the city was quiet, the tension in the car thick and suffocating. Hannah sat in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the dark road ahead, but her mind was a million miles away. The encounter with the hunter had rattled her more than she cared to admit, and the weight of the case was pressing down on her like never before. Tate glanced at her, concern etched on his face. "You okay, Hannah?" She nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was true. "We need to find him, Tate, before he kills again." Tate sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He's always one step ahead. It's like he knows what we're going to do before we even do it." Hannah couldn't disagree. The hunter had proven time and again that he was more than just a killer. He was a strategist, a master of manipulation. And now he was targeting her directly, taunting her with his messages, pulling her deeper into his twisted game. As they pulled into the precinct parking lot, Hannah's phone buzzed again. She hesitated before looking at it, half expecting another message from the hunter. But this time it was a call, from an unknown number. She answered cautiously. "This is Detective Carter." The voice on the other end was shaky, barely above a whisper. "Detective, you need to listen to me. It's about the hunter." Hannah's pulse quickened. "Who is this? Please, Meet me at St. Mary's Church. Come alone. I can't talk over the phone. He might be listening. The line went dead before Hannah could respond. She stared at the phone, her mind racing. This could be a trap, another one of the hunter's sick games. But something in the caller's voice had sounded desperate, terrified even. If it was a genuine lead, she couldn't afford to ignore it. Hannah didn't tell Tate about the call. She didn't want to put him at risk, not when they were so close to something. Anything that could break the case wide open. She made her way to St. Mary's Church alone. The streets empty and silent as she drove through the night. The church was old, its stone walls weathered and cracked, the kind of place that seemed to hold secrets of its own. Hannah parked a block away, her senses on high alert as she approached the entrance. The heavy wooden doors creaked as she pushed them open, the dim light of the candles casting flickering shadows across the nave. The church was empty, save for a single figure sitting in the front pew, his head bowed in prayer. Hannah approached cautiously, her hand hovering near her weapon. The man looked up as she drew closer, revealing a gaunt face etched with fear and guilt. "You're the one who called me?" Hannah asked, keeping her voice low. The man nodded, his eyes hollow. "I need to tell you something. Something that I should have told the police a long time ago." "Who are you?" He hesitated, his hands trembling. "My name is Samuel Drayton. I'm Marcus's brother." Hannah's heart skipped a beat. "You know the hunter?" Samuel nodded slowly, tears welling in his eyes. "Yes, I know him all too well." Hannah took a seat beside him, her mind racing. "Tell me everything." Samuel began to unravel a story that chilled Hannah to the core. His brother, Thomas Drayton, had always been different, distant, cold, with a fascination for hunting that went beyond mere sport. But over the years, that fascination had morphed into something far darker. Thomas had become obsessed with the idea of the perfect hunt, one that involved not animals but people. "It started with small things," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He would disappear for days, come back with strange injuries, talk about how he was getting closer to his ultimate prey. I didn't understand at first. I didn't want to believe it. But then people started dying." Hannah listened, horrified, as Samuel recounted how Thomas had carefully selected his victims, stalking them, studying them, until he was ready to strike. He described how Thomas would come home after each kill, his eyes alight with a sick satisfaction, talking about how the thrill of the hunt was the only thing that made him feel alive. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Hannah asked, trying to keep the anger out of her voice. "I was scared," Samuel admitted, tears streaming down his face. "He's my brother, and he made me swear not to tell anyone. He said he'd kill me if I did. But I can't live with this anymore. Not after what he's done." Hannah felt a surge of pity for the broken man sitting beside her. He had been living in a nightmare, torn between his loyalty to his brother and the horror of what Thomas had become. But now he was ready to make things right. "There's more," Samuel said, his voice shaking. "Thomas, he's planning something big. He said it's going to be his final hunt, the one that will outdo all the others. I don't know what it is, but it's happening soon. You have to stop him." Hannah's mind raced as she processed the information. This was it, the break they had been waiting for, but they had to act fast. Thomas Drayton was a man on the edge, driven by a twisted desire for the ultimate kill. And if they didn't find him soon, more lives would be lost. "Do you know where he is?" Hannah asked, her voice urgent. Samuel shook his head. "No, but I think he's been staying in an old hunting cabin, deep in the woods. It's where he always went when he needed to disappear." Hannah's blood ran cold as she remembered the cabin they had raided earlier that night. Had they missed something? Was Thomas still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike? "I'll send a team to check it out," Hannah said, standing up. "Thank you, Samuel. You've done the right thing." Samuel nodded, but the guilt in his eyes was still there, lingering like a dark shadow. Please just stop him, before it's too late. Hannah left the church with a sense of urgency burning in her chest. She knew they were running out of time. The hunter's final hunt was about to begin, and if they didn't catch him now, the city would pay the price. Chapter 5. The Final Hunt. Hannah moved with urgency, her mind racing as she left the church and drove back to the precinct. Samuel Drayton's confession weighed heavily on her, the revelation of the hunter's true identity finally bringing a face to the terror that had gripped the city. But now they were up against the clock. Thomas Drayton was planning his final hunt, and she had to stop him before he could unleash his deadly scheme. As soon as she arrived at the precinct, she called an emergency meeting with her team. The mood in the room was tense as Hannah relayed everything Samuel had told her. The weight of the new information hung over them like a dark cloud, but it was also a spark, a lead they could finally act on. "We don't have much time," Hannah said, her voice firm as she addressed the room. "Drayton's been planning this for a long time. He's chosen his targets and he's set his trap. But we have an advantage now. We know who he is, and we have a possible location. We need to move fast." Tate nodded, his expression grim. "We need to search that cabin again. If he's there, we can't let him slip away this time." Hannah agreed, but she also knew they needed more than just brute force. Drayton was a master at evasion, a predator who thrived on the thrill of the chase. They had to outthink him, anticipate his moves before he could make them. She ordered a thorough search of every property linked to the Drayton family, focusing on the remote hunting cabin Samuel had mentioned. But Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. Thomas Drayton was meticulous, a man who planned his kills with surgical precision. If he was preparing for a final hunt, he would have thought of every detail, every possible scenario. He wouldn't just be hiding, he would be setting up a final, lethal confrontation. As her team worked to gather more information, Hannah delved into Drayton's past, searching for any clue that might reveal his endgame. She pored over old case files, surveillance footage, and reports from the earlier murders. It was like piecing together a jigsaw puzzle, each detail potentially holding the key to unlocking his twisted mind. Hours passed, and frustration gnawed at her as the pieces refused to fit. Then something caught her eye, a pattern in the locations of the previous murders. They formed a rough circle around the city, the cabin almost at its center. It was as if Drayton had been marking his territory, slowly closing in on his final prey. Hannah's breath caught as she realized what he was planning. Drayton wasn't just targeting random victims, he was creating a map, a hunting ground where he could control every aspect of the chase. And at the heart of that map was the cabin, the place where it would all end. She quickly pulled up the city's grid and overlaid the locations of the murders, connecting the dots in a way that revealed Drayton's twisted strategy. The cabin wasn't just his hideout, it was the staging ground for a series of coordinated attacks. He had set up traps across the city, each one designed to draw the police away from the real target. "What are you thinking?" Tate asked, noticing the change in her demeanor. Hannah looked up from the map, a grim determination in her eyes. "He's trying to split us up, keep us distracted while he goes after his main target. This isn't just a hunt, it's a massacre in the making. We need to be smarter. We need to anticipate his moves, not just react to them." Tate nodded, the seriousness of the situation sinking in. "So what's the plan?" "We hit the cabin, but we do it strategically," Hannah said, her mind already formulating a response. "We'll send a decoy team to flush him out, while the rest of us move in on the real target. If he's setting up traps across the city, we'll need to coordinate with every unit. We have to defuse them before he can trigger the final attack." Tate quickly began organizing the units, while Hannah contacted bomb squads and tactical teams. She briefed them on the possible locations of Drayton's traps, emphasizing the need for speed and precision. There was no room for error, not when the stakes were this high. As the teams mobilized, Hannah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, mixed with a gnawing fear that they were playing right into Drayton's hands. He was out there watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. But this time, she wouldn't let him win. The drive to the cabin was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Hannah's team moved in silence, their faces set in grim determination. As they neared the location, the tension grew, the forest closing in around them like a shroud. The cabin came into view, its weathered walls and darkened windows exuding an ominous presence. They parked the vehicles at a safe distance, moving in on foot to avoid detection. The decoy team took up positions around the perimeter, ready to spring the trap that would draw Drayton out. Meanwhile, Hannah and the main unit circled around to the back of the cabin, where she believed the real threat would emerge. The night was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant call of an owl. Hannah's pulse quickened as they reached the back of the cabin, her senses on high alert. She could feel the weight of the moment, the knowledge that this could be their last chance to stop the hunter. They took their positions, weapons ready, waiting for the signal from the decoy team. The plan was simple: create a diversion at the front of the cabin, forcing Drayton to flee out the back, right into their waiting arms. But as the minutes ticked by, Hannah's unease grew. Then, the signal came, a loud crash from the front of the cabin, followed by the sounds of shouting and gunfire. The decoy team had engaged, and now it was their turn. Hannah tightened her grip on her weapon, her eyes fixed on the cabin door. But nothing happened. The seconds dragged on, each one filled with an unbearable tension. Then, the door slowly creaked open, revealing a shadowy figure stepping out into the night. Hannah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized him. Thomas Drayton, his face hidden in the shadows, but the cold, calculating aura unmistakable. He moved with a calm, deliberate grace, his eyes scanning the darkness as if he knew exactly where they were. Hannah raised her weapon, but before she could fire, Drayton moved with lightning speed, disappearing into the trees behind the cabin. "Go!" she shouted, and her team surged forward, chasing after him. The forest was a maze of darkness, the trees towering above them like sentinels. Hannah could hear the rustle of leaves, the crack of branches, as her team pursued Drayton through the underbrush. But he was fast, too fast, and the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. Hannah pushed herself harder, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she sprinted through the forest. She couldn't lose him now, not when they were so close. The sound of gunfire echoed through the trees, and she knew her team was closing in. Then, she saw him, a fleeting glimpse of his figure slipping through the trees ahead. Hannah raised her weapon, her finger on the trigger, but before she could take the shot, something caught her eye. A glint of metal, barely visible in the underbrush. A trap. Hannah barely had time to shout a warning before the trap was sprung. A loud explosion ripped through the forest, the force of it knocking her off her feet and sending her crashing to the ground. The world spun around her, her vision blurring as the shockwave reverberated through her body. She struggled to her feet, her ears ringing, blood dripping from a cut on her forehead. The explosion had thrown her team into chaos, and she could hear shouts and cries of pain in the distance. But her focus was singular: Thomas Drayton. Hannah staggered forward, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of him. But he was gone, vanished into the night like a ghost. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. They had walked right into his trap. Desperation surged through her as she frantically searched the forest, her thoughts racing. She couldn't let him get away, not after everything they had been through. But as the minutes ticked by, the truth became undeniable. He was gone. The forest was silent once more, the only sound the distant cries of her wounded team. Hannah's heart sank as the weight of failure settled over her. Thomas Drayton had outplayed them again, slipping through their fingers just when they had been so close. But as she turned to regroup with her team, something caught her eye. An object lying in the underbrush, half buried by leaves and dirt. She knelt down, brushing it off to reveal a small metal box, its surface scratched and battered. Inside was a single handwritten note. Asterisk, the final hunt has begun. You're not the only prey. Asterisk. Hannah's blood ran cold as she read the words, the full scope of Drayton's plan dawning on her. This wasn't just about her or her team. He was planning something far bigger, something that would send shockwaves through the entire city. And they were running out of time to stop it. Chapter 6. The Last Stand. Hannah's mind raced as she stared at the note, the implications of Dr. Drayton's message sinking in like a lead weight. The final hunt wasn't just a trap for her. It was a citywide catastrophe in the making. Drayton had set his sights on a far more devastating goal, and they had mere hours to prevent it. She quickly regrouped with her team, who were tending to the wounded and assessing the damage from the explosion. The mood was somber, the sense of failure hanging over them like a dark cloud. But there was no time to dwell on their mistakes. They needed to act, and fast. Hannah pulled Tate aside, showing him the note. He's planning something bigger, Tate. This isn't over. We need to warn the city. Tate's eyes widened as he read the message. What could he be planning? Another bomb? Maybe, Hannah said, her voice tight with urgency. But whatever it is, it's going to be big. We need to coordinate with every department, bomb squad, counterterrorism, SWAT. We need to find him before he can pull it off. They quickly mobilized, calling in reinforcements and alerting the mayor's office. The city was placed on high alert, with officers fanning out across key locations. Government buildings, public transport hubs, crowded shopping centers. The fear was palpable, the tension in the air thick as the clock ticked down. Hannah felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her like never before. Every decision she made, every order she gave, could mean the difference between life and death. But she couldn't let fear cloud her judgment. She had to stay focused, had to outthink Drayton in this final, deadly game of cat and mouse. Hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. Reports of suspicious packages, bomb threats, and sightings of Drayton flooded in from all over the city. Each lead was chased down with ruthless efficiency, but none of them led to the man himself. He was still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Hannah's phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number, and she felt a surge of dread as she opened it. Asterisk, it's almost time, detective. Can you feel it? The thrill of the hunt? The taste of victory? Asterisk. Hannah's jaw tightened as she read the words, anger flaring in her chest. Drayton was taunting her, relishing in the chaos he was creating. But she refused to give in to his mind games. She would find him no matter what it took. As the night wore on, the pieces of Drayton's plan began to fall into place. The bomb squad discovered multiple explosive devices planted in key locations around the city, each one rigged to detonate simultaneously. It was a coordinated attack, designed to cause maximum devastation. But there was one bomb that stood out from the rest, larger, more sophisticated, and located in a high-profile target. City Hall. The realization hit Hannah like a sledgehammer. Drayton wasn't just trying to cause chaos. He was going after the very heart of the city's government. City Hall was evacuated immediately, the surrounding area cordoned off as the bomb squad moved in. Hannah and Tate arrived on the scene, the tension in the air almost suffocating. The building loomed above them, dark and silent, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around it. "This has to be it," Hannah said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "This is where he's going to make his last stand." Tate nodded, his expression grim. "We need to find him before he can set it off." They moved into the building with a team of officers, sweeping through the darkened corridors with weapons drawn. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old wood, the only sound their footsteps echoing off the walls. Every shadow, every flicker of movement, set their nerves on edge. As they made their way through the building, Hannah's senses were on high alert, every instinct screaming that Drayton was close. He was here, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for them. The thrill of the hunt was palpable, a pulse of adrenaline that kept her moving forward. They reached the central atrium, a large, open space with a grand staircase leading to the upper floors. The bomb squad was already there, working frantically to defuse the device. A massive, complex structure rigged with enough explosives to level the entire building. Hannah's eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of Drayton. But the space was empty, eerily quiet except for the ticking of the bomb's timer and the murmured voices of the technicians. Then she saw him. Drayton was standing on the balcony above, his figure barely visible in the shadows. His face was obscured, but she could feel his gaze fixed on her, cold and calculating. He was holding something in his hand, a small device, a detonator. Hannah's blood ran cold as she realized what he was about to do. "Drop it!" she shouted, raising her weapon. Drayton didn't move. He just stood there, a dark silhouette against the gloom, his finger hovering over the detonator. The moment stretched out, the tension unbearable as Hannah aimed her gun at him, her heart pounding in her chest. But Drayton wasn't interested in negotiating. He was here for one reason only, to finish what he had started. With a cold, calculated smile, he pressed the button. Time seemed to slow as the device clicked, the sound echoing through the atrium like a death knell. But instead of an explosion, a loud, piercing alarm filled the air. The bomb squad had managed to disconnect the detonator in the nick of time. Drayton's smile faltered, the first sign of doubt flickering across his face. Hannah seized the moment, firing a single shot that hit him square in the shoulder. He staggered back, dropping the detonator as he clutched his wound. "Go! Go!" Hannah shouted, and her team moved in, storming up the stairs to apprehend Drayton. But even as they closed in on him, Hannah knew it wasn't over. Drayton was a man who thrived on the thrill of the hunt, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. As they reached the balcony, he pulled out a small, hidden pistol and fired wildly, forcing them to take cover. Hannah's pulse pounded as she crouched behind the railing, her mind racing. Drayton was cornered, wounded, but still dangerous. She needed to end this now before more lives were lost. She motioned for her team to cover her as she edged closer to Drayton's position. He was bleeding heavily, his movements sluggish, but the madness in his eyes was undimmed. He fired again, the shot going wide, and Hannah saw her opening. She lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. The pistol skidded across the floor as they struggled, but Drayton was surprisingly strong, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. He fought back with ferocity, his hands clawing at her, trying to reach for the knife strapped to his belt. Hannah gritted her teeth, using every ounce of strength to subdue him. She managed to pin him down, her knee pressing into his chest as she wrestled the knife out of his grasp. For a moment, they locked eyes, his filled with hatred, hers with cold determination. "This is the end, Drayton," she said, her voice steady. "It's over." Drayton's expression twisted into a snarl, his body tensing as if to make one last move. But before he could act, Tate and the other officers were on him, dragging him away and securing him in handcuffs. The fight was over. The hunt had ended. Hannah stood up, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body trembling from the adrenaline. She watched as Drayton was led away, his head bowed in defeat, the madness still simmering in his eyes. It was finally over. As the bomb squad finished disarming the explosives, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. They had stopped Drayton in time, prevented a catastrophic attack that could have leveled the city. But the cost had been high. Lives lost, people injured, and the city left scarred by the ordeal. But for the first time in months, Hannah felt a sense of peace. The hunter had been caught, his reign of terror finally brought to an end. She knew it would take time for the city to heal, for the people to feel safe again. But they had won. As she stepped out of the building into the cool night air, Hannah allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She thought of the victims, the people who had lost their lives to Drayton's twisted game, and she silently vowed to honor their memory by continuing to fight for justice. The city's lights flickered on around her, a reminder that life would go on, even after the darkest of nights. And as she walked away from City Hall, Hannah knew she would be ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.